With the Supreme Court's decision today to not reopen their decision on marriage equality, I figured it would be a perfect time to revisit the case Obergefell v. Hodges, which is the case that determined marriage equality. On June 26th of 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that under the 14th Amendment, same-sex couples had the right to marriage equality, and it required the states and the federal government to recognize the marriages of same-sex couples. Now, if you're too young to remember this period in American history, it was when the states were deciding whether same-sex marriage was a right. So if you lived in a state that legalized it, your state would recognize it, but if you ended up moving to another state that didn't recognize it, your marriage would not be considered a legal marriage in that state. And at the time, this affected so many things, from medical care to being allowed to see your partner in the hospital to being labeled on the death certificate. Now, the case that got brought before the Supreme Court was Obergefell v. Hodges. Now, Jim Obergefell was the main plaintiff in this case, and he had started by suing the state of Ohio to recognize his marriage to his partner. In 2011, Jim's partner, John Arthur, was diagnosed with ALS. With John's health quickly declining, in July of 2013, they would travel to Maryland, where same-sex marriage was legalized, and they would get married. Upon returning to Ohio and Ohio's same-sex marriage ban, they would be told that when John passed away, Jim would not be labeled as his living spouse on his death certificate. And they would sue the state of Ohio to recognize their marriage in the court case Obergefell v. Kasich. The day after filing the lawsuit, a judge would agree to take up the case because of John's quickly declining health, and would rule in Obergefell's favor, saying that the ban in Ohio was unconstitutional. The state of Ohio would appeal this, and it would go to a higher court, which would then rule in the state's favor, which would prompt it being sent to the Supreme Court. Now, before we get to the Supreme Court's case, I want to talk about Jim and John and kind of give context on why this was so important. John and Jim would meet in the early 90s at a bar just outside of Cincinnati, and they would go from dating to moving in together to building a life together, living their lives as a married couple in essence, without any of the rights or privileges that go along with that. And they would continue to build this life together until John's diagnosis of ALS, at which point Jim would be his caretaker until his passing. And they were very lucky that they had a great support system in their family and friends, to the point that their family and friends pooled money together to get a medical plane to get John to Maryland for their wedding. But if John's family hadn't been supportive, Jim would not have been able to make any medical decisions for for John's care, what to do once he goes into the hospital, what happens when he passes away, and what happens beyond that. Now, after being together for 22 years, John Arthur would pass away during the appeal that the state made to a higher court, meaning that their marriage was not recognized in their state before his passing. And I could imagine that this could really crush somebody and make them want to stop going forward with pushing for this lawsuit. But after John's passing, Jim made it his lifelong goal to make marriage equality legal in all the United States. Oral arguments for the case would begin in April of 2015, and what Obergefell's team brought to the case would be two things. The first being, was it constitutional for states to discriminate between gay couples and straight couples when it came to marriage licenses? And the second was to ask if the Constitution required states to recognize the marriages and marriage licenses of same-sex couples if they were legally married in another state. And with a 5-4 majority, the Supreme Court would rule in Obergefell's favor, requiring every state to recognize same-sex marriage. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote the majority's opinion, and this is what he said. No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a mutual union, two people become something greater than they once were. And this was Obergefell's response after finding out that he won. It affirms what millions across the country already know to be true in their hearts: our love is equal. The 4 words etched onto the front of the Supreme Court, equal justice under law, apply to us all too. Now, I still get choked up about that day because it's hard to explain what it was like growing up in a red state and just the state of America at the time. As someone who is stupidly in love with love, I never thought I would get the chance to marry the person that I loved. And while marriage is not the end-all be-all of everything, I never in a million years imagined that it would be something that the Supreme Court would decide in our favor. And it kind of crushes me knowing that John and Jim did not get to celebrate that victory together, and that their marriage was not recognized at the time of John's passing. And of course, I can't help but think back to my own marriage and think about what it would mean if it was no longer recognized or it had never been passed, and how that would affect both of us tremendously. And so I always like to talk about John and Jim because I think it's important to share how much they fought for us in the last years that they were able to spend together, because they didn't have to do that. And before I can work myself up into tears, I am going to stop there. And we are going to come back tomorrow for day 23 of Pride History. And as always, happy Pride.